The torch guttered in the dead air. Carl Richard Lepsius pressed his back against the stone wall and held his breath. Around him, the air smelled of something older than memory. Dust compacted by millennia, mineral silence, the particular stillness of a space that had not known a living exhale since the age of pharaohs. The year was 1843. The place was a corridor deep within a structure that no European had entered in over 1,000 years. And what Lepsius was staring at, carved into the limestone with the deliberate, careful hand of a master scribe, should not have existed. Not according to everything they had been taught, not according to the official record, not according to the history that powerful men in Cairo and London and Berlin had already decided was the only history worth knowing. He reached out and touched the hieroglyphs with trembling fingers. His Egyptian guide, a man named Hassan, who had brought him here through 3 days of desert travel and 2 nights of whispering negotiation with local villagers who spoke of this place only in lowered voices, stepped back into the shadows. Even Hassan, who had grown up within walking distance of ruins most Europeans would never see, seemed unwilling to look directly at what the torchlight was revealing. Lepsius would spend 3 more hours in that corridor. He would make meticulous copies of every inscription, and then when he returned to Berlin and laid his notes before the assembled scholars of the Prussian Academy, something extraordinary would happen. Something that history would quietly, efficiently, almost surgically remove from the record. Stay with this, because what comes next rewrites everything you thought you knew. To understand what Lepsius found in that corridor, you must first understand what the world of 1843 believed about ancient Egypt, and more importantly, who had decided what the world was allowed to believe. By the mid-19th century, Egyptology had become a battlefield disguised as a discipline. The decipherment of hieroglyphics by Jean-François Champollion in 1822 had cracked open the ancient world like a geode. And the beauty and complexity of what spilled out had immediately threatened powerful institutions. For centuries, the Church had maintained a careful chronology of human history, one rooted in biblical genealogy and the calculations of Archbishop James Ussher, who had famously determined that the world was created in 4004 BC. Ancient Egypt, with its towering monuments and sophisticated civilization, was already stretching the edges of that timeline uncomfortably. When scholars began translating Egyptian texts and discovered a civilization of staggering intellectual and administrative sophistication, one with medical knowledge that rivaled anything in medieval Europe, astronomical observations of breathtaking precision, and a theological tradition of extraordinary complexity, the implications were profoundly destabilizing, not just to the Church, to the colonial machinery of European empire, which had built itself on a foundation of civilizational hierarchy. On the comfortable assumption that complexity, refinement, and true knowledge flowed in one direction only, from west to east, from conqueror to conquered, from the enlightened to the primitive. Ancient Egypt dismantled that assumption with every tomb they opened, and so certain things, certain discoveries, certain inscriptions that pointed too clearly toward an inconvenient truth, they had a way of disappearing, of being reclassified, of being placed in storage crates that were sealed and never reopened, of being omitted from official publications in ways that were difficult to question and impossible to prove. This is not speculation. This is the documented behavior of institutions under pressure. And Lepsius, in the autumn of 1843, had just placed himself at the center of that pressure. Carl Richard Lepsius was not a reckless man. He was, by every account, meticulous, methodical, and deeply conservative in his scholarly conclusions. He had been sent to Egypt by King Frederick William IV of Prussia on one of the most ambitious documentary expeditions in history. The Prussian Egypt expedition, which would ultimately produce the 12-volume Denkmäler aus Ägypten und Äthiopien, a monument of archaeological documentation that remains indispensable to scholars even today. He was not looking for controversy, he was looking for confirmation. What he found instead was a series of inscriptions in a corridor at the site of Saqqara, the ancient necropolis south of Cairo, that referenced a tradition of knowledge transmission that contradicted the accepted narrative of Egyptian civilization's development. The inscriptions described in careful hieroglyphic detail a lineage of scribal knowledge that stretched back to a period scholars of the time insisted was pre-literate. a period when, according to the established consensus, no sophisticated written tradition could possibly have existed. The implications were staggering. If the inscriptions were authentic, and Lepsius, who was one of the foremost hieroglyphic scholars of his era, had no doubt that they were, then the timeline of Egyptian intellectual development needed to be pushed back by centuries, perhaps more. The civilization that built Saqqara, that carved these texts, that trained the scribes who composed them, was older and more sophisticated than anyone had yet been willing to admit. Lepsius wrote to his colleagues. He was careful, precise, and appropriately cautious in his language. He did not sensationalize. He simply presented what he had found and asked for a collective scholarly reckoning with its meaning. The response was not what he expected. Within 6 months of Lepsius's initial communication to the Prussian Academy, 3 separate senior scholars had published papers challenging the authenticity of the Saqqara inscriptions without having visited the site. One suggested that the carvings were later additions, a common explanation when evidence proved inconvenient, without offering any material evidence for this claim. Another questioned Lepsius's translation methodology, in terms so technical and so labyrinthine that only specialists could follow the argument, which was perhaps precisely the point. A third simply omitted any reference to the inscriptions in a major synthetic work on Egyptian chronology published in 1845, as though the corridor at Saqqara had never been entered, the torchlight had never guttered, Hassan had never stepped back into the shadows. Lepsius was not a man easily discouraged, but he was a man who understood institutions, and he understood with growing clarity that he was being managed, not through direct confrontation, that would have drawn too much attention, but through the slow, patient, almost geological pressure of institutional silence, of marginalization, of being talked around rather than talked to. He returned to his documentation. He buried himself in the 12 volumes of the Denkmäler, and the Saqqara corridor, with its impossible inscriptions and its ancient, unbroken silence, was not among the plates published in the final edition. What was he afraid of? What had been threatened, directly or indirectly, in those months between his discovery and his silence? The archive of his personal correspondence, held in Berlin, contains a gap of almost 4 months in late 1844, a period during which, by his own later account to a trusted colleague, he received visits from representatives of 2 European governments and 1 senior official of the Egyptian administration, then under Ottoman control, who had significant financial interests in controlling the narrative of Egyptian archaeological discovery. 4 months of letters that no longer exist, a corridor at Saqqara that was not rediscovered by another European expedition for nearly 40 years. Ask yourself, as you sit with this, what does it take to make evidence disappear? Not explosively, not dramatically, but quietly, efficiently, with the clean administrative precision of people who understand that the most effective censorship is the kind that leaves no fingerprints. 40 years later, in the winter of 1881, a French archaeologist named Gaston Maspero was leading a team through the limestone hills of Deir el-Bahri on the west bank of the Nile, near the ancient city of Thebes, when his Egyptian colleagues made a discovery that would electrify the scholarly world, and simultaneously confirm what Lepsius had glimpsed and then been silenced about, though no one would make that connection publicly for another generation. The discovery was the royal cache, a hidden shaft tomb concealed beneath 40 meters of limestone, containing the mummified remains of more than 50 individuals, among them some of the most powerful pharaohs in Egyptian history: Ramesses II, Seti I, Thutmose III. Kings and queens who had ruled an empire stretching from the Sudan to the Levant, whose names had been inscribed on temples the length of the Nile, who had commanded armies, built cities, and corresponded with the rulers of Babylon and Hatti as equals, lying together in a single hidden chamber, their identities deliberately obscured, their funerary goods stripped, their original tombs emptied, and their bodies moved in a single, massive, covert operation carried out by Egyptian priests sometime around 1000 BC. The cache had been hidden deliberately, not by grave robbers, by the priests of Amun, who in the chaotic final centuries of the New Kingdom had watched helplessly as tomb after royal tomb was systematically plundered and had made the extraordinary decision to gather up the most sacred royal remains and hide them so effectively that 3,000 years would pass before they were found again. Maspero stood at the bottom of that shaft and wept. He was not a man given to public displays of emotion, but the weight of what surrounded him, the stillness, the presence of 3,000 years of deliberate concealment, the faces of pharaohs wrapped in linen in the torchlight, undid him. He later wrote to a colleague in Paris that he had felt, in that moment, like a man who had accidentally opened a door that the universe had intended to remain closed. What moved him was not just the discovery itself, it was the evidence of the concealment, the careful, intelligent, terrified concealment, because the priests who had hidden these bodies had left records, not public records. Those had been carefully sanitized, but private records tucked into the bandaging of certain mummies, written on small pieces of papyrus in a priestly shorthand that spoke plainly of what they were doing and why. They were hiding the truth, not from grave robbers, though that was the surface justification. They were hiding the truth from a political authority that had decided the truth was inconvenient. An authority that had already begun rewriting the official record, chiseling names from monuments, repurposing temples, constructing a new narrative of Egyptian history that erased certain reigns, certain innovations, certain lineages of power and knowledge that the new rulers found destabilizing. Sound familiar? It should, because this is what institutions do. In every age, in every civilization, the methods change, the motivations are always the same. But here is where the story becomes something stranger and more significant than even Maspero understood in that moment. Among the mummies in the royal cache was an individual whose wrappings bore no royal cartouche, no name, no title, no indication of rank or identity. Maspero's team cataloged this individual as unknown male C and moved on. The great pharaohs were the story. An unnamed body was a footnote, except that the unnamed body was wrapped in a manner that no other mummy in the cache, or indeed in any known Egyptian burial, replicated. The bandaging technique was extraordinary in its precision and complexity, requiring a level of anatomical knowledge and manual skill that Maspero's chief medical consultant, a French physician named Fouquet, described in his private notes as being comparable to the finest surgical techniques of contemporary European medicine. Fouquet noted this. He noted it carefully in a private journal that was not submitted as part of the official excavation report. He also noted that among the items placed within the wrappings of unknown male C, placed deliberately, not accidentally, was a small roll of papyrus inscribed with what appeared to be a systematic medical text. A text that, in its organization and its specificity, bore a structural resemblance to nothing so much as a modern clinical manual. Fouquet, who was a careful and principled man, brought this to Maspero's attention. Maspero, who was also a careful and principled man, brought it to the attention of the Egyptian authorities, who were at that time operating under the administrative oversight of the British occupation. Egypt had come under British military control in 1882, the year after the cache's discovery. The papyrus was examined, it was catalogued, and then it was transferred under the authority of the British administration to a storage facility in Cairo, where it remained, uncatalogued in the public record, inaccessible to independent scholars, for the next several decades. You are not meant to look away here, because this is the moment where the machinery becomes visible, where you can see the gears. The papyrus from unknown male C was not unique in its fate. The history of Egyptian archaeological discovery in the 19th century is haunted by objects that entered administrative custody and did not emerge, by finds that were recorded in excavation notes and then vanished from official inventories, by scholars who published preliminary findings and then, in their final reports, quietly omitted the most extraordinary elements without explanation. This was not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense, not a shadowy cabal meeting by candlelight to suppress the truth. It was something more mundane, and therefore more durable. It was the collective, self-reinforcing behavior of institutions and individuals who understood, without being explicitly told, that certain findings were unwelcome, that careers were built on consensus, that funding came from governments and private donors who had ideological investments in particular versions of the past, that the simplest path, the safest path, was to file the inconvenient thing away and write the report that everyone expected. This is how history is made, not by dramatic erasure, but by quiet omission. By the accretion of small decisions, each individually defensible, that together construct a wall between the past and the present. Lepsius understood this. He lived with it. He died in 1884, the year the British consolidated their administrative control over Egyptian antiquities, having published 12 volumes of magnificent scholarship and carried in the private architecture of his memory the knowledge of a corridor at Saqqara that the record said did not matter. Maspero understood this too in his way. He spent the rest of his career fighting, with mixed success, for Egyptian control over Egyptian antiquities, a battle that was as much about who controlled the narrative as it was about who controlled the objects. He wrote in an essay published in 1903 that the greatest danger to historical knowledge was not the tomb robber, but the administrator. Not the man who broke in to steal, but the man who sat behind a desk and decided what the world was ready to know. He did not name names. He did not need to. The corridor at Saqqara that Lepsius entered in 1843 was re-examined in 1886 by a British expedition led by Francis Llewellyn Griffith, one of the finest philologists of his generation. Griffith's notes, preserved in the Griffith Institute at Oxford, contain a single reference to the corridor, a reference that describes the inscriptions as being of uncertain date and significance, and recommends further study. No further study was commissioned. No further study was funded. The inscriptions remained on the walls. They did not care about the politics of the men who looked at them. They did not require authentication or institutional approval. They simply waited, as they had waited for millennia, in the dark and the mineral silence, for someone willing to see them clearly. History does not disappear. It accumulates. It compresses, like limestone under its own weight, and it waits. The things that were buried, the corridor, the unnamed mummy, the papyrus, the 4 months of missing letters, they are all still there, in archives and storerooms and limestone hillsides, patient beyond all human impatience, waiting for the moment when the institutions that suppress them have grown too distant to object. What the priests of Amun understood when they carried those royal bodies down into their hidden shaft and sealed the entrance with rubble and silence is the same thing that Lepsius understood and Maspero understood and Fouquet understood. In his private journal that no one was supposed to read, that truth does not require permission, that knowledge, once it exists, cannot truly be destroyed, that the people who try to bury it are always working against time, and time is the one opponent that is never lost. They wrapped unknown male C in bandages that spoke of extraordinary knowledge. They placed a text inside his wrappings that described what they knew. They hid him among kings in a place so deeply concealed that the desert itself became his guardian. They were trying to preserve something, not destroy it. In the very act of concealment, they were betting on the future, betting that someone would eventually come down the shaft, lift the torchlight, and read what they had left behind. That is what the priests of Amun believed. That is what the scribes who carved those impossible inscriptions at Saqqara believed. That is what every person who ever committed a dangerous truth to papyrus or stone or whispered memory believed. They believed in you, in whoever comes next, in the persistence of curiosity against the machinery of omission. The corridor is still there. The limestone does not forget. And somewhere in an archive in Cairo or Oxford or Berlin, in a box that has not been opened in decades, the 4 months of missing letters wait in the dark, patient as stone, for the hand that will finally break the seal. What they knew, they carved in walls that outlasted every empire that tried to silence them. What you do with that knowledge, that is yours to decide.